I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
The Democratic leader and I have had an opportunity to have a discussion, and it leads to the following. We'll now cast a vote on the witness question, and once that vote is complete, I would ask that the Senate stand in recess, subject to call of the chair.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered. The question is, shall it be in order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents? The yeas and nays are required under Senate Resolution 483. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. No. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Burr. No. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mrs. Capito. No. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. No. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. No. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Kramer. No. Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Daines. No. Ms. Duckworth. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Enzi. No. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Gardner. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Graham. No. Mr. Grassley. No. Ms. Harris. Aye. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Hoven. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Jones. Aye. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. King. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Langford. No. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Lee. No. Mrs. Loeffler. No. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. McConnell. No. Ms. McSally. No. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Moran. No. Ms. Murkowski. No. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Perdue. No. Mr. Peters. Aye. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Reed. Aye. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Roberts. No. Mr. Romney. Aye. Ms. Rosen. Aye. Mr. Rounds. No. Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.